welcome everybody to this webinar on remote workshops. This is the second in our series. We did one previously on how to run high-performing teams in a remote world, which you can find on the Miro board, which we'll share with you later in the session. This one is a deep dive into remote workshops and team facilitation, etc. I think some great hints and tips. I'm going to hand you over to Neha, who's going to be running this session. I'm the helper in the background, so over to you.
Awesome, thanks Dave. Yes, hello everyone, my name is Neha. Nice to see some familiar names. So what we're going to be doing is talking about how to sort of run remote workshops. Just as a bit of a sort of guidance before we start going into the details, what we're going to do is be sharing some information, some tips, and an example of a workshop that we ran in the past. And this is going to be on this virtual board called Miro. This is a tool called Miro, which we use quite a bit in our virtual or our remote workshops. To make sure that you can actually see everything that we're going to share, what we'd recommend is that you move the Zoom videos, if they're on your screen, to the bottom left-hand corner, because we're going to be using a lot of the right-hand side of the screen to actually share some notes and tips. So if we start by zooming in here, let's talk just a little bit about what it's like running a workshop in the office versus running a remote workshop, because there's quite a difference, as I'm sure you're aware. When we're running remote workshops, it feels a little bit like all of a sudden someone switched off the light, you know, and it feels a little bit like we lose a lot of the visibility, the flexibility, and the control we would normally have and that we're used to when we're running workshops in the office with everybody in the same room. I mean, but part of the visibility side is that we can't see each other's faces as clearly, we can't read those social cues as easily. We also lose a little bit of flexibility because, you know, if we were running a workshop in person, if we needed to, we could always call a timeout, take breaks whenever we want, drag people back into the meeting room, and even change the agenda as we're going through. And obviously that's much harder to do when we're doing a remote workshop because everybody's on the video call together and it can create a lot of confusion. And in turn, it does feel like we actually decrease a lot of the control that we have when we go into this remote setting. Now, while all of those things absolutely hold true, we do also believe that their opposite holds true. So for example, we actually do also increase visibility, flexibility, and control if we use the right kinds of tools in the right way in remote workshops. So as an example, on the visibility side, with remote workshops, we use tools like Miro, where as people are thinking about things, they add notes and they add post-its to the virtual board. Now that gives us earlier visibility of what people are thinking, much earlier visibility than if we were running a workshop in person. Because if we were running a workshop in person, generally we give people 5 to 10 minutes to write their thoughts down and then we put things up on a board. So it's only really 5 to 10 minutes after someone's thought of something that you actually start to see what everybody else is thinking, and then you have to absorb a whole lot of information in one go. Whereas by using tools like Miro, everybody's adding their thoughts in real time. So you're slowly starting to get an idea of what people are thinking and start to build your own thoughts and your own responses to what's going on. So we do actually get better visibility in some respects. In turn, we also actually get a little bit more flexibility in some ways. Another example would be that if we're running a workshop in the physical world, you know, if we're using a physical whiteboard, you know, we often find ourselves in that situation where we run out of space. So we have to take a photo of what's on the board, erase it, and then start up again. Whereas with tools like Miro, you've got an infinitely sized canvas. So you don't actually run out of space. And if for whatever reason you want to move things around, it's much easier to select like 50 post-its and move them to another part of the board, as opposed to try to select 50 post-its on a physical wall and move those around. So there's a lot more flexibility that we have using some of these tools. And in turn, that does mean that we do have more control in certain respects. I mean, one of the ways in which we've seen teams in some ways actually get better at moderating remote workshops than in-person workshops is thinking very carefully about how people speak and contribute to workshops. So for example, having rules like you mute yourself by default and you unmute to speak means that we sometimes set up a bit of an extra control in there, so that if we've got some people who tend to speak more than others, there's a conscious thought that needs to take place before they actually speak. And hopefully it starts to create a little bit more space for everybody to kind of contribute. There's also things like, look, if you make the rules very clear that everybody should be allowing space for everybody to speak and people don't respect that rule, you can always mute people. You know, you've made the rules very clear. They're not following the rules, so you can mute people. And that's something you can do in the remote world over a video call. But again, in person, in the real world, you can't really put your hand over someone's mouth and ask them to stop talking. It's incredibly inappropriate, incredibly aggressive. So there's different rules, different etiquette, different tools that we use in the remote world that don't necessarily work in the same way in the physical world. So when we're running these remote workshops, what we try to do is think about the remote workshop from the ground up. So rather than try to turn a workshop, an in-person workshop, into a remote workshop, we try to understand what are the things that make remote workshops successful and design them from the ground up from a remote experience perspective. So we will go through an example to talk about that in detail. This is an example of a workshop that we actually ran fairly recently. And after we do the example, we're going to talk about some next steps that we'd like you to think about and then offer you some further reading if you're interested. So looking at this example, I'm now going to bring up some notes on the right-hand side of the screen. And these are the notes that I'm going to be running through to kind of explain some of the tips that we follow when we're running remote workshops. So this is around designing and running workshops. It doesn't include the usual tips that you would have for running or designing in-person workshops. So we're assuming that when it comes to facilitation, for example, you're fairly comfortable with, you know, what the basics are around facilitation. This particular scenario is around a fully distributed, digitally literate team. They're working from home and they're setting OKRs, or objectives and key results, for the next quarter. And if you're not familiar, objectives and key results are kind of like goals. They're measurable and they're a really powerful tool for getting different teams focused on the same kind of outcome. So it's a great tool for creating alignment and also empowering teams. So we will share some reflections and tips, and these are universal. They don't just apply to running an OKR session. You could apply these for running a vision workshop or a design sprint or even a team building exercise. And we'll talk about the preparation side. Then we'll talk about how to facilitate the remote workshop, and then we'll wrap up with some closing thoughts. So let's start with preparation. First point is that it takes longer and more thought to design and run a remote workshop smoothly. And there's a number of reasons around why it takes longer. As we go through the tips, hopefully it'll become clear. But it's really important to give yourself enough time. So the first thing that we try to do is give ourselves roughly around twice the amount of preparation time than we would take if we were doing an in-person workshop. With this particular example, if this workshop was to run for 5 days, then we would typically say, okay, it probably requires around 2.5 days of prep time for an in-person workshop. Because this is a remote workshop, we would double that. So we'd say, okay, it might take maybe 4 days of prep time. And part of the reason is that you want to set up templates. You want to set up really clear instructions and templates that you not only use for this workshop, but you can use thereafter as well. Right, so once you've given yourself enough time to prepare, the next point is to look at the virtual board that we have here. So the virtual board is everything. So design it like you would design a website. You know, when we think about the attendees for a workshop, think about them as users of a website. They're trying to get a job done, you know, so let's try to make it as easy as possible for them. So the way that we start with that is we first think about the visual map. People are really good at navigating maps. So let's lay out the whole workshop in a map-like kind of format. So over here, we've got what we call a single glance mental map. What that means is at a single glance, our attendees should ideally be able to set up a mental map in their minds around what are the activities and what's the sequencing of the activities that we're going to be doing. As an example, you can see that there's some pre-work that's been booked here. And then you can see that we've got the workshop split over a couple of days. And if we zoom in further, there's various topics that we're going to be exploring as well. So you can quite easily at a single glance start to see exactly what the flow of activities are and what's going to be achieved during the workshop. And the way in which we do that is, again, following another practice from the world of website design, which is thinking about information architecture. So how are we using colors, font sizes, and so on to try to create meaning for the attendees who are looking at the agenda? For example, all of the headings here are in purple, in dark purple. And you can see that there are some next level headings in this lighter purple, like the welcome session and where we are right now. And then all of the activities are in white. And there are some activities, these are actually the pre-work activities, which are in this mauve kind of color. So all of these colors actually mean something very specific, and we'll go into some details shortly. Right, so in line with thinking about our attendees as being users of a website, we try to understand what are the jobs that our attendees are trying to do. And in this particular case, there's just two jobs, there's two tasks. One is to do some prep work between the sessions of the workshop. The second is to do the actual activities during the sessions of the workshop. So there's just two types of tasks that they need to do. And that's why all of the activities have been split into two different types of colors. For example, over here where we've got pre-work, it's kind of in a mauve-ish color. And then if we look throughout the rest of the agenda, we can see that there are other boxes in mauve, which highlight the other bits of pre-work that we need to do. And we've got clear instructions in terms of when the work needs to be done by. So again, we've used color here. And so if we zoom out at a single glance, you can see there's kind of 4 chunks of pre-work that need to be done for this particular workshop. So it gives a very clear signaling to our attendees as to how much work might be required in their own time. And what we also have here is a very clear direction of flow. Over here, the activities go from left to right. There's a logical sequencing there. And then within each of these sections, like in the welcome session, we've got a number of lower level detailed activities. And so we've got arrows just to kind of highlight the flow of those activities. And this is not only useful for the attendees to have a sense of how they're going to be working through the agenda, it's also really useful for you as a facilitator, because there are so many things that you need to think about and monitor when you're facilitating. You want to get as many things onto the board as possible so you don't have to remember anything specific. So, you know, having this clear sequencing easily leads you through the workshop, plus by having the times written here for each of these activities. So this one is to take 10 minutes, for example. What you can do is you can quite easily monitor whether you're running on time or not, because you know that this overall session, which you can see up here, should actually take an hour. And you can kind of, as you're going through each of these activities, you can just in your mental map figure out how much time is remaining. Another thing that we've done to kind of help with setting expectations and helping with the facilitation side is to make sure that all of the activities are on the board before we even start the workshop. So this sets the expectations for the attendees, because then they have a sense of what it is that they're going to be doing. They can do a little bit of pre-work, they can get familiar with the types of activities they'll be doing, which is great. It also makes it easier for you as a facilitator, because then you don't have to be thinking about how you're going to plan subsequent sessions as you go through. Now, there are some examples when you might not want to put an activity on the board, or you actually might want to just cover it up, because there are some activities that we run to really sort of take people out of their comfort zone, to think really creatively and think outside of the box. And for those sorts of activities, you don't want to give any preparation time. You really want to just spring it upon people so that they get shaken out of their sort of usual way of thinking. For those sorts of activities, you could still put them on the board, but maybe cover them up with a big white box, so that, you know, it's still somewhat hidden, but it's there as a placeholder. Or you could do what we did over here, which is that we actually put a placeholder here. So you can see there's an exercise called A Typical Day in 2023. We put that there as a placeholder to remind us that this was an exercise that was coming, and we saw that it was going to run for 10 minutes. So we've got that as a marker there. And what we did is, on another part of the board, we actually put the detailed exercise, so that when it came time to do this, all I had to do was click and drag it over, and you know, it was pretty straightforward. So apart from those sorts of exceptions, we'll generally want to put as many of the activities that we're going to run on the board before people actually join the board. And then the last point around this is around, you know, when we're thinking about user journeys, one of the things that attendees want to do is know how are they progressing through the activities. So we want to make sure that we not only highlight the progress that they're making, but we also make it very easy to direct them to certain specific parts of the board, depending on what it is that they're doing. In this particular example, we can see progress here by the purple headings. So the welcome heading, where we are right now, and the North Star activities, these bars are colored purple because these are the activities that actually we've already done as a group, which means that what we have left are how we'll get there and the wrap-up activities. So at a single glance, we can see that actually we're roughly halfway through this particular workshop. So again, this board is a little bit like a website. It's showing us how we're progressing in real time. And another thing that it does is it has these very clear, what we'd call call to actions. So this start here is a very bright yellow box. I mean, we might need to think about different ways of making this obvious if we have some accessibility considerations, like around color blindness, etc. But this is one way to kind of highlight that, look, this is where you need to start. And we've got this big fat arrow pointing to this preparation box, which means that this is where we're hoping all of the attendees come to in order to pick up their activities for the next lot of sessions for this workshop. So how we signpost is really important. So when we've thought about our virtual board and how we set that up, the next thing is to focus a little bit more on the people and think a little bit about energy levels. Remote workshops are more exhausting, and we can't really leverage the energy in the room the way that we could if we are, let's say, running an in-person workshop. You know, we just don't have the same shared space to leverage the energy levels. So what we try to do is, as I mentioned earlier, design it for a remote first experience. So design it knowing how to make best use of the tools that we have. One of those aspects is to think about having more sessions spread over a longer period of time, rather than having a single session which runs for longer. As an example, this particular workshop is spread out over 4 days. What we actually did is, rather than have a single 8-hour video call, which would have been horrendous for everybody, what we said instead is we're going to split that up across 4 days and have 1.5 to 2 hours across those 4 days. So not only did it give people enough time to do prep work and think between those sessions, but it also meant that we didn't have to worry about things like video fatigue. It was a great way to combat video fatigue. And what it also did is save time in certain aspects, especially around circular conversations. So this is called having asynchronous sessions. So what we did is we had these bits of prep work that we asked people to do. And we gave very clear dates when we wanted the prep work to be done by, how much time we thought it would take to do the prep work. We had instructions for what to do. And then what we did is we invited people to comment. We invited people to actually spend the next 2 to 3 days before the next workshop session to actually comment on the tickets that they were raising, ask questions of each other. And what we actually found happened was that people were having a lot of detailed conversations, and they were starting to get a greater sense of alignment. So rather than have those sorts of conversations happening over video call, a lot of that happened in people's own time when they were able to factor it in. It gave them time to reflect on what their colleagues were saying as well. So what that meant is, by the time we actually had the video call, we were able to have that as a shorter call for, like, let's say an hour. And we were able to focus a little bit more on not only aligning and converging, but actually highlighting what were the areas where we didn't have alignment, and park those topics and set up separate forums to actually discuss those sorts of things. Because I think another challenge that a lot of teams face with remote workshops and even remote meetings is that there's a lot of circular conversations, and it sometimes feels like we're not making progress. So a great way to combat that is to have these asynchronous sessions. Especially as a facilitator, you get amazing early visibility in terms of where there's confluence and where there's dissonance or disagreement on certain topics. And you know, there are going to be some situations where obviously you still need to have a call, a video call that goes for more than 45 minutes, you know, might be for an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours. And in those cases where you do that, again, thinking about video fatigue and body fatigue, it's important to factor in more breaks. So we would do things like either give people comfort breaks at the 45-minute mark, or even do things like have movement snacks. So movement snacks are a great concept where you spend 5 minutes doing a series of movement exercises as a team, just to kind of loosen up the muscles that might be tense from having sat at a desk for a couple of hours. There's also some great movement snacks to release eye tension, because, you know, you're staring at a screen for so many hours. It can be helpful to, like, look at faraway points and, you know, do some various eye exercises. So again, factoring in some of these breaks gets the blood rushing, it releases tension, and it helps people focus when they come back afterwards. There's also even more fun ways in which to do that. And this kind of leads on to our first pro tip. So these pro tips are extra considerations, you know, that we would like for you to think about with remote workshops. And there's an important point around energy levels. You know, how we manage energy levels in a workshop are really important. So it's important to do things like think about how we're balancing out the deep thinking exercises that are slow and considered, versus the high level energy or the high level thinking exercises that don't go into so much depth, but you need more momentum and they need to be kind of snappier. You need to make sure that you're thinking about how you're balancing these two different types of activities. And over time, you start to get more of a sense of intuition in terms of how long these activities need to go for in order to maintain momentum. But there's always a balance needed between those types of activities. And when it comes to energizers, there's a lot of great online energizers. At Equal Experts, we do actually have some free online icebreaker cards. We will add a link to this board before the end of this week. So you can come back in and you can access those icebreaker cards. But just even things like that, where you get people to ask questions of each other and answer them, or maybe even play charades, you know, in terms of answering the questions by acting it out or even drawing on the board. There's loads of ways in which you can actually incorporate energizer exercises into these workshops. And of course, despite all of the planning, we know that remote workshops can go wrong in so many different ways. You know, there's so much that goes into booking these workshops and organizing these workshops. And at the end of the day, we rely so much more on the tech, on the technology, than we would in, let's say, an in-person workshop. It's really important to make sure that we try to keep things simple. We do try to minimize the tools that we use. So at a minimum, we would have something for video. In this case, we tend to use Zoom. Something for the whiteboard. So as you've seen, we tend to use Miro. Something for chat. Again, we tend to use the Zoom chat because most people are on the Zoom call. And we use something to document the findings and the outcomes afterwards. Now, although obviously all of the work has been done on the board and you can share this board with anybody in your organization, if you were to share this board after a workshop with someone who hasn't participated, it's more than likely that they'd get quite overwhelmed by all of the information that's here. So it's still important to create some sort of lightweight summary for people and then publish that somewhere, whether it's on Confluence, on SharePoint, in Google Drive. And if people are interested, then they can come visit the board and they can see how you came to those particular summary, that summarized kind of understanding. So the way in which we kind of work with the tools is we try to make sure that we create very clear instructions for all of the attendees in terms of what tools we're using and how we're using them. Over here, you can see at the beginning of the workshop that we ran, we actually had a session just for 5 minutes talking about what tools we would use and how we'd use the tools. So we said that we'd use Zoom and have the video on by default so we can actually see each other. We would mute by default, especially if you had a noisy background. We'd use the Zoom chat, and very importantly, we would have a fallback chat option in Miro. Now, what that meant was, because we were using the video as the primary mechanism for talking to each other, if for whatever reason someone's Wi-Fi wasn't great, or their video kicked them off, or there was some sort of problems to do with the video, they would then lose the ability to chat with us. So we said, if that happens, use the chat option in Miro, and then that way at least anybody on the board will be able to see that you're having problems and we can jump in and help you out. So having that fallback option is really important. And that ties in with the whole concept of how do we make sure that we preempt for issues. So one of the ways in which we try to manage issues and we try to keep the momentum going for workshops is making sure that we think about co-facilitators and helpers. You know, so over here on this particular call, I am leading us through some of the activities. So I'm playing a bit of a leading role, and Dave is playing a monitoring and helping role. So he's behind the scenes, he's actually taking away, there we go, he's taking away some of the markings that I put on the board. He's wiping it clean so that we don't get distracted as we move through. He's monitoring the Q&A, you know, looking at what's happening in the chat. So having a split of responsibilities makes it much easier when you're facilitating and running these remote workshops. We tend to sort of split the responsibilities based on who leads and who monitors, but there's different ways in which you can split the responsibilities. One thing to say though is whoever is leading should not be doing troubleshooting of tech, because that starts to completely disrupt the momentum of the workshop. So generally the helper will be helping to troubleshoot any tech issues behind the scenes. And also, if you have breakout sessions, so if you use Zoom like we do, you know that there's the breakout rooms feature and people can go into different rooms and have conversations and do their exercises in smaller groups. Now, when that happens, again, it's really helpful to have helpers, you know, at least one helper per room. And each of those helpers can keep working with the facilitator to say, listen, I think there's a common problem here. You know, at least 3 groups are having the same sort of challenges. And that gives a good signal to the facilitator that maybe we need to bring everybody back into the main room, re-explain the instructions, maybe change the exercise somewhat, and then people can go back once everybody's aligned and is on the same page in terms of what they need to do. So these sorts of breakout sessions are also a great way for getting a lot more helpers and facilitators involved. Now, we did speak a little bit about planning. There are some further things to think about when it comes to planning these workshops and avoiding issues. One thing is to think about the old school tools. So like, you know, Post-its, pens. I also have a timer here. I have some paper on my desk just to kind of keep track of how things are going. Of course, you can have, you want to be able to put as much information as possible onto this virtual whiteboard as you're working through the workshop. But there are going to be some things that you actually want to take notes of that you don't want to share with everybody, either because there might be a certain observation. So for example, the helper or the co-facilitator may notice some strange dynamics between some of the attendees, and they'll want to make a note of that, you know, so make a note on a piece of Post-it. Or they may notice that there are some taboo topics, or there are some areas where it didn't feel like there was proper resolution. So making a note of some of those things that you don't want the whole group to necessarily be aware of right then, it really helps having these sorts of tools to do that. We also spoke a little bit about the Fallback Chat, so I'm not going to go into that again, but just all I'll say is it's super important and it's something that gets forgotten quite easily. And lastly, another thing that helps with the planning and making sure that people can actually participate equally and fairly is to have some warm-up exercises around the digital tools. Because the participants of the workshop may have different levels of digital literacy and confidence, it's important to make sure that we create a safe space where people can become comfortable with the tools. And where they need support, we make sure that we cater for that support. One thing that we can do is maybe before we start the workshop, we give early access to the board and we have a fun exercise that we get people to do, or we get them to do some sort of a warm-up exercise. So this is one that we did a little bit earlier today. You know, we asked people to basically create a Post-it, add a tag to the Post-it, you know, maybe even use the drawing tool just to get familiar with how that works. It's just a couple of little light exercises to get people familiar will make a big difference in terms of how they participate. And this is all about inclusion. This is making sure that we're being digitally inclusive with all of our attendees. I mean, another thing that you could also do is actually have these warm-up exercises at the beginning of an exercise during the workshop. So it's best, you'll be best placed to basically figure out what's the appropriate way to tackle this depending on the confidence of the attendees and depending on how much time you have for running the workshops. The next point that we want to talk about is around communication, because this is obviously quite key. So one thing is around the rules and the etiquette and being very clear on what the rules and the etiquette are for a workshop. Again, during the welcome session for this workshop, we went through the rules and the etiquette. So we spoke a little bit about, you know, not multitasking and making sure that people were available throughout the workshop. The other thing that we did is we spoke very specifically about how to communicate, because how we communicate in a digital virtual world is very different to how we communicate in person. So yes, we need to over communicate and actively listen. We need to be very careful about the kind of language we use and the speed at which we speak. For example, I tend to speak very quickly, and if we're in an in-person workshop, you can always kind of say, whoa, Neha, could you just repeat that please? Or could you slow down? And I can repeat things relatively easily. In a remote workshop, it's far less likely that people are going to call you up on things like that. For various reasons, there are certain barriers for participation, especially if people aren't comfortable or confident. So it's important to actually slow things down, try to use more accessible language to make sure that actually there's less scope for confusion or less opportunity for confusion amongst the attendees. Another point I want to talk about is this one, which is around the awkward silences. Another bit of feedback that we've heard from a lot of facilitators and even attendees is that it sometimes feels like you have no idea whether people are participating or not, whether they're really engaged or not. And it's because sometimes you'll ask a question of the group, like, How does everybody feel about that? And there's pin drop silence. There's absolutely nothing that comes through. And as a facilitator, you know, you then start to get into a spiral of like, what's going wrong? You know, what can we do differently, etc. Now, one thing that I think it's important to acknowledge is that awkward silences are actually good, because on the one hand, some people actually need a bit of time to process what's going on. And sometimes absorbing information over video call takes longer time for some people to process than in person. So some people need that time to think. Some people also don't feel comfortable necessarily being the first person to speak up. And other people actually are afraid of interrupting somebody, and which is why they also hang back. So there's a number of reasons why people don't speak up straight away. That's why it's important for you as a facilitator to still allow for those silences, allow for people to think and to work through those silences. But it's important to call those out, because it's one of those things that people don't explicitly talk about. So at the beginning of the workshop, saying, listen, we're going to have those awkward silences, right? And here are some of the reasons why. That is totally fine. But if for whatever reason, you know, you don't feel comfortable speaking up, then please drop me a line and we will try to, you know, chat through some other channel, whether it's through Slack or something like that. But talking about the awkward silences is important. And it's important to also acknowledge this next point, which is that they do have an impact on the team energy levels. Not just the awkward silences, but even the fact that we're working in a remote workshop, it does have an impact on the energy levels as opposed to if you're working in person. So it's not just the responsibility of the facilitator, it's the responsibility of the whole team to make sure that we have momentum, and everybody should be trying to motivate everybody else. And it's not to say that it should always be high energy. As I was saying, you have high energy and low energy activities, but everybody should be thinking about how do we keep going forwards. Some ways in which facilitators do that is obviously they exaggerate their body language and they speak in a greater volume. They might speed up a little bit, you know, so there's all sorts of techniques you can use to change the energy levels and manage the energy levels of the team in the workshop. And then the last point around sort of communication is really about giving cues to people so that they can keep going and they can kind of self-monitor and self-regulate. So what I mean by that is if you've got an activity that takes, let's say, 3 minutes, so one person is speaking for 3 minutes, make sure you have some sort of a countdown available in the video so they can see the countdown. So, you know, I might put my phone up to the video so they can see the countdown. And when there's 30 seconds left, I'll say there's 30 seconds left just to remind them. So this creates a certain amount of pressure, not too much, but just the right amount of pressure to make sure that people are focusing on the right points and getting to the right level of detail and not going down a rabbit hole. It also keeps the momentum going, because it's common feedback that a lot of these remote workshops tend to overrun. And we'll talk a little bit more about other techniques as well to make sure that these workshops don't overrun. In fact, I think that's the next point that we have in our first pro tip. So one of the reasons why workshops overrun is because people think about the time that's required for activities, but they don't think of it around the time around the activities. So this is what we call accounting for the time in between, or the in-between time. So this is at the end of an activity, before the next activity, or even between handovers between people. Like if, let's say, you've got 5 people who have 3 minutes each to give a bit of an update, you could say that should take 15 minutes. And in an ideal world, sure, that would take 15 minutes. In the real world, that probably takes a lot longer, because what happens is the first person will take roughly 3 minutes, but then there'll be questions, clarifications that the rest of the attendees will want to ask. So then that 3 minutes kind of turns into 4, maybe 5 minutes, you know. So before we're done, what we actually find is that it's maybe even 20 to 30 minutes before we're done with those 3-minute updates. So when we're thinking about planning for these activities, always allow a bit of a buffer and think about how you're going to facilitate. Again, having those countdowns and showing people how much time is left is very helpful for getting people to focus on what's necessary to be said. Another thing is also to do things like offer people the option to continue, thumbs up, or to stop, thumbs down. So maybe every minute that overruns, you ask people to continue or to stop. And then that starts to actually give you a sense, and it makes people actively think about, are they really getting value from continuing this conversation? Because sometimes you get so involved in the conversation, you're not able to take a bit of a step back and go, actually, this is irrelevant. We don't need to be talking about this right now. So treating it a little bit like a lean coffee and asking those questions helps actually refocus people on whether this is really important to discuss right now. And it helps them self-regulate. And the next point that we have here is about having transcribers. this is not only from an accessibility point of view, but also in terms of capturing the essence of what someone said, but you kind of missed. So we have, for example, otter.ai as a tool that we use for remote workshops and sessions where what happens is the live transcription. Yep, thanks, Dave, shared the link in the chat. It transcribes what's being said in real time. So again, this is amazing from an accessibility perspective, because then if there's anybody who doesn't have great Wi-Fi, or who doesn't have English as their first language, or who might be hearing impaired, for example, they can actually follow the conversation, follow the workshop without being discriminated against. And also for you as a facilitator, or you as a participant, if you're trying to, let's say, write down what someone has just said, but you kind of missed the essence of what they said, you can always go back to the transcript, copy, and then paste that onto the board without having to ask someone to repeat themselves and interrupt the flow and the momentum of the conversation that's taking place. So really have a think about playing around with tools like Otter. They can be incredibly powerful. Right, so once we've actually thought about the preparation side, which, as you can see, there's a lot of consideration that goes into the preparation side, then we think about the actual facilitation of the workshop. How are we actually going to make sure that this is a success? Well, the first challenge is to acknowledge that it's harder to maintain perspective for the attendees. We spoke a little bit about mental maps earlier on. So people, humans, we like to think in terms of maps, and we orient ourselves based on maps. And in an in-person workshop, we would typically have our walls being filled with lots of activities, so we'd be able to sense how we're progressing through in terms of getting our understanding. We would also be seeing each of our colleagues nodding and shaking their heads, so we get a rough idea of how aligned we are on various topics. We don't have that necessarily in this quite the same way with remote workshops. So the way in which we use mental maps is a little bit different. What we do is we try to constantly zoom in and out of this board just to remind people about how they are and where they are through the process of the workshop. For example, if we were to start, let's say, the Wednesday the 19th session, so this session over here, if we were going to start this session, what we do is we probably start zoom out. I'd probably share my screen with the attendees and I'd say, okay, so this is what we're going to do today. Just as a reminder, what we did in the past is we had our welcome session. We spoke about where we were right now, and here are the top 3 things that came out. We set our North Star, which was really inspiring. And now what we're going to do is figure out how we're actually going to get to that North Star. How are we going to get there? And then I'd zoom in further and talk about the specific exercises we do. Then I'd zoom in further, and then we'd actually start doing the first exercise. And then at various points, probably zoom out and remind ourselves, now, some of the conversations we're happening aren't focused on how we're going to get to our North Star. So let's park those topics and let's make sure we're focused on answering this question. And then at the end of the session, zoom back out again and say, great, so now we have a sense of how we're going to get to our North Star. The next step will be to do a bit of a wrap up. And then after that, we'll be able to kind of continue on working through these projects. So the constant zooming in and out helps maintain perspective. It helps people figure out what's the right level of detail to engage in. And again, like we mentioned earlier, it helps people filter out some of the noise that they might share. Because, sometimes when you're doing an exercise, you kind of get lost in the weeds a bit. So the constant zooming in and out helps people elevate their level of thinking a little bit. And I think we've already spoken about the visual marker progress, so we don't need to go through that again. But the idea is that a single glance, people can see how far they've worked through the activities of the workshop. Okay, so the next point is that it's easier to be confused and harder to get feedback with these remote workshops versus in-person workshops. So we mentioned a little bit earlier that it's important to actively listen, but what does that mean? It sounds like fluff. A very specific thing that you can do is to have a dual screen setup. What I mean is that as a facilitator, this is, I would suggest, mandatory to have 2 screens running at any point in time. One screen has the video, so the video call with all of the attendees to make sure you can see all of the attendees' videos, and the chat as well. And then the other screen has the virtual whiteboard, in this case Miro. And by having both of those things going in parallel, you're not only able to lead people through the board, but you're also able to monitor and see how people are progressing and where people are stuck or where they might have questions. If participants can also do the dual screen setup, that would be fantastic. It would make them feel a lot more empowered and give them the feedback from their colleagues as well, in terms of whether people agree or disagree on various topics. But that's not always possible. Or perhaps it requires a little bit of a different approach. for example, sometimes what I've done is I've used my mobile phone for the videos, and I've used my laptop then for the virtual board. So there's different tools that you can use. You know, if you're not lucky enough to have like 2 laptops, for example, as most of us aren't lucky enough to have. Then the second point around trying to reduce confusion is to read what you write. Now, this is specifically for facilitators. You know, it's quite common for people to actually ask the attendees to look at an exercise, and what they'll do is they'll explain the exercise in their own words, in their own language. And what's happening is people are trying to read what's on their screen while they're listening to you speak. So their mind is split. And because their attention is split, it means that they're neither able to absorb fully what's on the board, neither are they able to fully absorb what you're saying. So it ends up in a half understood kind of result. What we'd rather do is actually have very crystal clear instructions for what the attendees need to do, and those are written on the board, and that is exactly what you read out. So rather than ad-lib too much, read out exactly what you have on the board, and then make sure that you open things up for questions, you know, so you can clarify any questions people have. And the reason why we would suggest writing those instructions on the board is that if for whatever reason, halfway through an exercise, people actually forget or they need a reminder, it's important to have that written down so they can constantly refer back to them without having to ask you. So again, treat it like a website, make it super clear, and that way people will be empowered to do the work themselves. We've already spoken about awkward pauses. So all I'll say around this is that while you do have the awkward pauses, there are ways in which you can also shift or flip the responses. So instead of always getting a verbal response from the group, what you do is you get visual responses. So you can agree some visual cues. So rather than ask questions like, okay, I think we're good, and be quite fluffy, you can ask very specific questions like thumbs up if we think we're happy to move on with this exercise, thumbs down if we want to keep talking, go. And then you'll see all the attendees do a thumbs up, thumbs down. What would be even better is to then play that back to the group and say, okay, everybody except for one person has said, let's continue. So let's continue. And what that does is it basically tells everybody what level of alignment is there. Because not everybody's going to be able to see each other's videos, you as a facilitator need to communicate how much alignment there is and communicate that everybody except for one person has said, let's continue. So having these visual cues also gives you back a little bit of that control, gives you back a little bit more of that visibility in terms of how people are doing. And you in turn as a facilitator can give back that visibility to the attendees by telling them how they've responded to the questions that you're asking. That certainly ties in with this next point, which is around closing all the feedback loops. So the feedback loop is basically, I ask a question, you give me a response. You know, anytime there's anything that goes in one direction, make sure you clarify, things come back in the other direction. So when I'm running a workshop, for example, I will constantly ask, does that make sense, everybody? Thumbs up, thumbs down if it doesn't make sense. And see what people say. You know, are we okay to move on? Thumbs up. Or do we want to continue talking? Thumbs down. And then I will specifically call upon people to actually discuss or to raise their questions. So for example, if, 5 people have said thumbs up, 2 people have said thumbs down, I'll say, okay, there's enough people who said thumbs down, so I'd like for one of the people who said thumbs down to please, I'll give you 30 seconds, share your thoughts about why you disagree. So just sort of closing all those feedback loops and providing space for people to discuss things is really important. And we've already spoken about the transcription notes, but again, if you ever need to, you can always go back to the transcription notes, and not just you as a facilitator, you can share those notes with the whole group. So you could have that running with a link on the Zoom call, so that anybody who's on the Zoom call can click on the link, can see the live transcription, and they can make sure that they're aligned with the rest of the group. Okay, so those are sort of the bulk of the sort of tips that we wanted to talk about around designing and running these remote workshops. Before we sort of move on to closing thoughts, perhaps we can go through some of the open questions that we have from people on the call.
Okay, we've only got a couple of questions actually, but and one of them I think we have answered, because it's all about how do you combat the silences and disjointed conversations that often occur on video calls. And I think you've covered that pretty comprehensive, so I'm going to move that one on. And the other one is, sorry, unless you want to add something. Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm just wondering, Gary, if you have a further question about the disjointed discussions, can you drop in a question around that with maybe some specifics so we know how we can respond to that? Because I agree, I think we've totally covered the silent side. But if there's anything that's missing, just drop us another question and we'll address that.
Great. Okay, and the other one, which is how do you move all attendees to another part of the board or canvas?
Love this question. Okay, we're going to show you right now, actually. So there's different ways to do it. One way, which we use on Miro, is to follow someone. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on Dave's face at the top of this board. And what you're going to see now, I'll just close, sorry, just give me 1 second. I'll close the notes and click on your face, Dave. So by doing that, what I'm doing is I'm following Dave around the board. So as he's zooming in, as he's zooming out, as he's moving around, I can see exactly what he's seeing. So as a facilitator, you can get people to follow you around the board. That's one way to do this. Another way is in Miro, you've actually got, the really cool thing is all of these boxes that we have here, they actually, if I unlock that, each one of these boxes actually has a unique URL. So if I copy that link, there's a deep link to that part of the board that I can therefore send to anybody. So I could drop that link in Zoom, and when people click on it, they'll come to that specific part of the board. So again, it's a great way to direct people to exactly where they need to be. And lastly, I mean, you can always do things like move your big start here to different parts of the board. You know, if that's the thing that's most obvious, then you can kind of move that around and get people to look at that. So loads of different ways to do that. Hopefully that answers the question.
That's great. We've got another one coming here, actually. Would you recommend for participants of a virtual workshop to use their own devices rather than a subgroup calling in together using a Jabra, for example? Or are there clever ways of managing that?
Oh, we have very strong views on this one. Do you want to go,
yes.
Dave? Yeah.
Yeah. If one person's remote, everyone's remote. Yeah. I think that's the mantra that I would follow. So that means that even if, let's say there are 5 people in a workshop and 4 of them in the same room, everybody has their laptop open, everybody is using their own device essentially. And obviously if you're in the same meeting room, you do have some conflict around from the audio, so maybe the audio is going through one laptop or something like that, or maybe people can use push to talk or some other tool like that, so they are automatically muted or unmuted. But what you're trying to do here is you're trying to make sure there's a level playing field for all participants, and you do that by making sure that everybody's using the tools. As soon as you get somebody who isn't in that environment and they're off up on a whiteboard or something similar, you have this imbalance of power.
Absolutely. And that actually quite nicely leads to our closing thoughts. I mean, our first point is that difference is amplified when we work remotely versus in person. So we need to focus on inclusion. You know, in every aspect of what we do, we need to be as inclusive as possible. And as Dave said, you know, one person's remote, everyone's remote. It feels really weird the first couple of times you do it, where you've got some people in the office and everybody's on a laptop, you know, joined to the same thing. But once you get used to it, you'll actually start to see it's incredibly powerful. Because what it also does is it means that as a facilitator, I'm no longer a single point of failure for everybody who's on the call. You know, people aren't waiting for me to update a board. Everybody's in the board themselves and they're updating it themselves. You know, the only time sorry, Dave, you want to say something?
Sorry, no. I thought that was a pause there. Shelley's just asked another question here, and just quickly jump onto that, which is we use Miro quite often, and participants end up grabbing and dragging things by mistake, which absolutely they do. Yes, I think locking can cause issues for interaction with some objects. What do you think?
Mm-hmm. Yes, locking can cause issues when interacting for some objects. It can also be incredibly useful for others. I mean, what we probably need to do is know specific examples of where you have or haven't where you haven't locked something and people have moved it around. So for example, I recently had a workshop. In fact, this particular workshop, I had 16 participants, and for one of the exercises, we had close to like 60 post-its raised. So you can imagine people are raising all these post-its and they're moving things around, and it got a little bit chaotic at various points. So we had to kind of set up a couple of rules as to how we were going to do things. We had to extend the size of the canvas that we were working on as well, and do various things like that, you know, to kind of pivot and adjust the exercise in real time. So maybe if you can give us some more specific details afterwards, we can talk about how we could potentially tackle that specific challenge in a different way.
Okay, shall we move on?
Cool. Yes, so we mentioned that it's important to focus on inclusion. So let's have a look in terms of what we actually mean. So we mentioned the transcription service. Another thing that we've done is following someone. So, you know, there's following someone on the board. There's also having something like a buddy to help out. And Dave, you've got a story around this and how this worked in a recent workshop as well, isn't it?
Yeah, so if you have somebody who is perhaps, well, it could be any range of accessibility issues. So it could be somebody who's not particularly familiar with digital tools. It might be somebody who is partially sighted or has or struggles in some way. We recommend that you have some sort of buddy, and that might be one helper, or it might be somebody else who is on the call. And then you can do things like if they're happy using the chat but not particularly comfortable around putting post-it notes or putting detail onto the board itself, then they can put something up into the chat channel, and then somebody else takes that and puts that and enters that so everybody else can see it. So you end up with a system where everybody's still getting their ideas, etc., put onto the board. And I think that works really well. There's also a question actually that's come up here around clarifying on the transcription notes, especially when people are aware we have some people who are deaf. So the tool that, as Neha mentioned, we're trialing with is otter.ai, which does live transcription. It opens it up into a separate page or a separate website and just runs the transcription live there. I don't know how that works for screen readers because we haven't tested that, and likewise I don't know how screen readers work with something like Miro. But it's certainly worth an investigation, although there is obviously a bit of a cost for that. There's a monthly charge for that service.
Yeah, and perhaps this is something that we can do a deep dive into after this particular webinar with you. Awesome. The next point is that as a facilitator, it's really easy to feel insecure. What's that not disappearing? Anyway, easy to feel insecure, you know, because you're not getting the same feedback from your attendees that you're normally used to. Again, just embrace it. Just know that that's part of how interactions work in the virtual world. So just try to work through that and use some of those visual cues to keep the momentum going. Lastly, because you're planning these activities out, and hopefully you can see that it takes a lot of thinking, you know, to really design these workshops well. What you actually do is you actually get better at thinking a few steps forward. You get used to thinking a few steps ahead, and what are the implications of doing a particular exercise in this way versus that way? What are the problems people might face? Therefore, what can I do to preempt those problems? You know, you really good. It really exercises certain parts of your brain, which are fantastic. So we're hoping that you would agree with us that while we do lose a bit of the visibility, flexibility, and control in running these remote workshops, actually we do gain a lot of visibility, flexibility, and control as well that we wouldn't necessarily have in the same way if we were doing all of these exercises in person. So we can actually work through those challenges to still run workshops very effectively. So for some next steps, what we would recommend is, first of all, have a think about, you know, what are the right tools? Pick the right tools for you and your team. At a minimum, figure out what's the whiteboard going to be, because this is the one tool that actually most teams tend to not think about. So start by thinking about your virtual whiteboard. We use Miro, we've used Mural. There's various other tools as well, including Microsoft Whiteboard. I know a number of the attendees on the call have used Microsoft tools. You know, think about the chat, the video, the documentation tools as well. When it comes to designing and running your workshop, what's the next workshop going to be? You're more than welcome to follow the template that we've set up here for the OKRs. You'll probably need to tweak it for your own context. We also have another template coming out soon around remote inceptions. But, you know, as we mentioned, you could also run a virtual vision workshop. You could do a design sprint, you know, a team building exercise, any host of other exercises. If you'd like some help, just let us know and we'd love to speak to you about it. I think, Dave, we're going to share the link to the Miro board as well in the Zoom chat, aren't we? So
Yes, I'll do that now.
Nice one, thanks. So please feel free to come into the board and check out what you've already seen. And if there's some specific topics you'd like to explore, like talking about how co-facilitation works or how to manage difficult stakeholders, again, drop us a line. There's so much that can be discussed and explored in each of these different areas. And these are all really important considerations for running remote workshops. And then once you've thought about those things, please do feel free to share this board with your colleagues. This is free. It's up there on the open, internet. So come back as many times as you like. If you thought this was a useful talk, please feel free to check out our first talk, which was on being in a remote team. Feel free to sign up for our newsletter to watch the next webinar, which will be on remote inceptions. And most of the information that you've seen here is actually in our playbook. There's an open source free playbook that you're welcome to download and use, to your own convenience. If you'd like to add to it, feel free to contact us and we'll add your contributions to the book as well. And if you'd like further reading, there's various blogs and videos that you can watch here as well, including the icebreakers that I mentioned. So the online icebreakers are here. So if you click on this link, access the playbook, for example. Awesome. So that is basically, those are our thoughts on how to design and run remote workshops well. We're hoping you found that useful. Please do give us feedback. We'd love to hear from you in terms of what you found useful and what you'd like to hear more on.